Hello, and welcome to Lessons in History. The yellow today is what happened in the American West. Today, we will look at the events that cover our American West course. We will be visiting the Mormons and their love of polygamy, the natives and their love of the buffalo, and the American government and their love of breaking promises. As requested, I've included specific dates of events to help with your revision. As always, timestamps for individual events can be found in the comments below for the event that you find most tricky. Kicking things off in 1820 was the Missouri Compromise. As westward expansion continued, so did conflict between the North and the South. As territories in the West were settled, they could eventually apply to become United States states. The states joining the Union were balanced between slave and free states. But in 1819, Missouri was due to join as a slave state. The Missouri Compromise allowed Missouri to join, but Maine was also created as a free state to maintain the fine balance. No new slave states were allowed to join in the North, and so began the long road to war over the issue of slavery. In 1830, Joseph Smith founded the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, known as the Mormons. He believed that an angel, known as Moroni, had given him a book from God, and his persuasive manner meant that he quickly attracted followers. He was, however, assassinated in 1844. The Mormons are a good example of why people moved west and the challenges early settlers faced. In this regard, it's persecution, and that is treating others in a cruel way because of race, religion, politics, or some other reason, such as being ginger. Gingers have souls! In short, in the East, Mormons suffered this persecution and therefore headed west. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 was passed by Andrew Jackson, an infamous president hated still to this day by native peoples. It forced Indians living in the eastern states to move to the west of the Mississippi River. Around 46,000 Indians had to move. Jackson promised they would never have to give up their land, which would become known as Indian Territory. He also promised that they would be protected from tribes already living in the west, as well as whites wanting to move west. How wrong he was. In 1834, the Indian Trade and Intercourse Act, better known as the Permanent Indian Frontier, established that Indian Territory was all of the land west of the Mississippi River, and not within the state of Missouri, Louisiana, or the territory of Arkansas. The goal was to keep whites and plain Indians apart peacefully, prohibited whites from settling on Indian land, and from selling guns and alcohol to the Indians. The Economic Depression of 1837 is a prime example as to why people wanted to go west and was acting as a push factor. This led to unemployment and the loss of savings. Many families looked to move west across the plains for the promise of free land and to escape the economic effects of the Depression. People lost their savings, wages, and unemployment rose. In the winter of 1838, the Mormons left Missouri and arrived in the newly renamed city of NAUVOO. This close-knit cooperative community of hard-working Mormons prospered, and by 1844, NAUVOO was the largest city in the state of Illinois. The Mormons tried to create an ideal society in which no one was poor or homeless, and where the evils of drink and smoking did not exist. There were now 35,000 Mormons, with more on their way from Europe, where Mormon missionaries had been hard at work. Most of these converts came from the poor and downtrodden. They were promised salvation and a chance to begin a new life. It seemed that Mormons had finally found peace at last. They governed themselves, and they had the well-armed NAUVOO Legion of Danites, consisting of around 4,000 men to defend them, better known as their secret police, which really irritated the Gentiles. Then, Joseph Smith made some very fatal mistakes. Jim Bridger, a former mountain man, built Fort Bridger on the Oregon Trail. Fort Bridger contained a store where travellers could purchase supplies, as well as a workshop where wagons could be repaired. If you watch The Revenant, you'll actually see a young Jim Bridger. It's not actually him, by the way, so don't think that it's actually real, thanks. I always remember Jim Bridger as acting as a bridge between both the white and Native American worlds. He also acted as a bridge, along with other mountain men, in helping spread information about how glorious fertile lands were in the West to Eastern people. This was spread through word of mouth. This information about fertile lands would certainly attract people in the East suffering from the Depression. Speaking of which, from 1843 onward, the Great Migration. About 1,000 people made the journey west to Oregon. This was the highest number of migrants to make the journey west in 1 year so far, and became known as the Great Migration. Remember, this is way before the gold rush and the speculators that came with it. These pioneers went west to start a new life. They are essentially the migrant equivalent of those on YouTube that write first in the comments, is that still a thing? Either way, as we all know, there is always someone before you. In this case, or in our case, it was the natives. The clue's in the name. In 1844, Joseph Smith received revelation from God in which he said, allowed certain Morgans to practice polygamy, that is to have more than one wife. By this time, Smith already had more than one wife and his bodyguard John Scott had five. Some of the Mormons thought that this was wrong, you think, and denounced Smith as a false prophet. They criticised him in a newspaper which they had set up. Smith replied by destroying the presses of the newspaper. This led to claims that Smith had turned into a dictator. People were also upset by the news that Smith was planning to run for President of the United States, fearing that he might make the evil practice polygamy the norm. On the 27th of June 1844, a mob of 200 non-Mormons, known as Gentiles, attacked the jail and shot Smith dead. Mobs now roamed the countryside, hunting down Mormons. Their new leader, Brigham Young, realised it was time to move. For some reason, along with Robert Koch, Manifest Destiny seems to be well remembered. John Sullivan, the editor of the New York newspaper The Morning Post, first used this phrase to express the long-held belief that white Americans had the God-given right and duty to occupy the entire North American continent. This term is a great one to drop into your responses as a motivator as to why so many went west. Some academics have even argued that there was a racial motivating factor behind this in the idea of bringing the white man to bring light to those less fortunate, i.e. the savages that misuse the land. The image on the screen, a painting by John Gast, is supposed to suggest that Manifest Destiny was people or God's will pushing them west, bringing light to the darkness that's in the west. Manifest Destiny, therefore, and individuals carrying out their manifest destiny is individuals carrying out God's will. A cooler teacher at this point would have said God's plan. God's plan. New leader Brigham Young knew that Mormons would constantly face persecution if they were going to stay in the East, and he famously called home that which no one wants. In the spring of 1846, he took 36,000 Mormons over 1,000 miles west to the Great Salt Lake. Now at this time, Salt Lake City as it is known today was part of Mexico, therefore outside of the United States laws. Now taking people west is one thing, but getting them there safely is another, and the reason why Mormons were so successful in getting there was Brigham Young's organisation and leadership skills. In January 1848, gold was discovered in California. Initially, news of the discovery was kept secret, but once it became known, people from the East flocked to California hoping to find gold and make their fortune. Those who arrived in 1849 became known as the 49ers. Remember, it was only the people that arrived early, really early in the year 1848, that made a fortune. However, due to the news not taking weeks but months to reach the eastern states, and then likewise would take months for people to actually travel to California, it is no wonder that the gold rush occurred almost a year after the discovery. People came from around the world, so much so that a foreign miners tax was passed by Congress. This goes to show the extent to which the discovery of gold acted as a catalyst for westward expansion. Now I know we've had a lot of Brexit in the news over the last few years, but let's leave that to one side. This is where the politics really begins. The Compromise of 1850 was meant to settle tensions of the newly acquired territories following the Mexican War, basically the bottom left of America stretching from California to Texas. This area was not covered by the Missouri line, so Northerners and Southerners argued about what to do with these states. Should these new states be free or slave states? As previously mentioned, with the discovery of gold in 1848 in California, settlers there applied to join the Union and did so as a free state in 1849. This angered the South and they considered secession, so the Compromise of 1850 was proposed. Under the Compromise, California joined the Union as a free state, but the people of New Mexico and Utah were allowed to decide if their states would be free or slave states. This was based on the idea of popular sovereignty, where settlers had the final say. The Fugitive Slave Act was passed, requiring all Americans to return runaway slaves to their owners, even if these slaves reached free states. The Indian Appropriations Act provided government money to pay for moving Plains Indians onto reservations. Due to westward expansion, more and more white Americans wanted to use Indian territory. Reservations were areas of land reserved for American Indians. They were controlled and managed by the US government. The Indian Appropriation Act had several aims. First, it represented a continuation of the government's aim to move Indians away from land that white Americans wanted to use and to protect American Indians from whites. A bit strange, do you not think? However, it also aimed to encourage Plains Indians to live more like white Americans. Reservations restricted the amount of land Plains Indians had to hunt the buffalo, and therefore forced some Indians to try and farm the land, just like white Americans. The Indian reservation system established tracts of land called reservations for Native Americans to live on while settlers took over their land. The main goal of the Indian reservations were to bring Native Americans under US government control and to minimize conflict between natives and settlers and encourage Native Americans to take on the ways of the white man. But many Native Americans were forced onto reservations with catastrophic results for generations to come. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 was between the Indian tribes and US government, and it redefined the Indian homelands. The treaty stated that these lands would belong to the Indians and that they would not be entered by white settlers. The Indians were to be given provisions for a period of 10 years as compensation for the land lost. In 1854, a Democrat, Northern senator called Stephen Douglas wanted Nebraska to enter the Union so its land could be developed. The South wasn't keen on the idea as Nebraska was above the Missouri line. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 was created as a compromise. Nebraska and Kansas were given popular sovereignty, the right to choose between becoming either a free or slave state. This undermined the Missouri Compromise, and as a result from this day, the Missouri Compromise was dead. There was a sectional struggle in Kansas as pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers tried to take control. In 1860, Republican Abraham Lincoln won the presidential election. He was a minority president. He only got 40% of the overall vote, and he didn't, most importantly, get any vote in the 10 of the southern states. Now, this is important when it comes to individual states deciding upon who represents them in Washington. In February 1861, the 7 states that had seceded from the Union formed the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as their president. When Lincoln was sworn in as Union President in March 61, he said that he wouldn't accept secession. There was still some US government troops in Fort Sumner in South Carolina. Lincoln refused to withdraw this garrison and he sent more supplies to the fort, but said he would only attack if the South did so first. In April 1861, Confederate troops attacked the fort. This triggered a civil war between the Union and Confederates. By August 1861, 11 southern states had seceded from the Union. Lincoln declared that the Confederate states were in rebellion. After the Civil War, Republicans and Northerners disliked how President Johnson drafted policies regarding the South. In response, Republicans in Congress rejected the president's idea of Reconstruction and began to dominate the floor with radical Reconstruction. Carpetbaggers were Northerners who travelled to the South after the war in search of economic gain and prosperity. Southerners viewed them as opportunists who wanted to exploit their resources and dominate politics. They were typically well-educated middle-class Northerners and former soldiers. Scalawags, however, check the spelling, were Southerners who opted to support Reconstruction and the Republicans instead of opposing them like the rest. Many were former Whigs who were non-slave holding farmers, merchants and artisans who remained in allegiance with the Union. They were considered traitors, scalawags, by Southerners, little scalawag. Immediately after the American Civil War in 1865, Reconstruction in the South began, which lasted until 1877. This era refers to the time when the United States was rebuilding under President Andrew Johnson, not Jackson. Reconstruction began with the following. 1. Reversing all land confiscated by the Union Army to its pre-war owners. 2. Swearing loyalty to the Union by Southern states to pay off war debts. 3. Implementation of the 13th Amendment stipulating the abolition of slavery. Key civil rights legislation was carried out both during and immediately after the American Civil War. Following the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, Congress passed the 13th, 14th and 15th Amendment. In summary, the 13th Amendment fully ended slavery in the United States. However, the southern states also passed black codes which restricted the rights to free slaves. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including former slaves, and guaranteed all citizens equal protection in the law. And the 15th Amendment, passed in 1869, gave free slaves the right to vote in elections. The Fort Wise Treaty of 1861 established the Sand Creek Reservation for the Cheyenne tribe. Many agreed to move there, however, some didn't, and those continued to fight the US Army, which in turn led to the Sand Creek Massacre. The Pacific Railroads Acts of 1862 encouraged railroad building by splitting the job between two companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, who would build from the east and the west to meet in the middle to complete the transcontinental rail. Companies were incentivized to lay rail by being offered $16,000 for every mile of track laid, and in addition, public land along the railroad which could be sold for profit. The Homestead Act of 1862 was another example of the government trying to both encourage settlement of the plains and encouragement of people to go west. The government said that 160 acres of land would be given to any individual that farmed on the land for 5 years. It had to be by an individual to avoid big landowners from buying up the land and selling it for a profit a few years later. The first major Indian war was known as Little Crow's War of 1862. Little Crow was chief of the Santee Sioux known as the Dakota, who lived on a Minnesota reservation. They were peaceful and accepted reservation life, but they nearly starved as a result of the Civil War shortages, a delay in their yearly payments from the government, cheated by traders, and poor harvest. In August 1862, 4 Dakota, returning from an unsuccessful hunt, murdered 5 settlers for a dare, as you do. Fearing retaliation on the entire tribe, Little Crow reluctantly led his warriors in an uprising. Hundreds of settlers and about 100 soldiers were killed. The uprising was ended when Dakota were defeated at Wood Lake in September. 38 Dakota prisoners were hanged, and most of Dakota were expelled from what was left of their land. The Cheyenne Uprising of 1863. The Cheyenne faced starvation because they couldn't grow food on their infertile reservation land at Sand Creek or find any buffalo. They decided to raid settlers' wagon trains for food. In April 1864, after a dispute over cattle, many Cheyenne began raids on ranches and stagecoaches, committing atrocities which outraged settlers. In August, the governor of Colorado issued a statement urging the hunting of hostile Indians. Volunteers shot any Cheyenne they saw. Upstep the Sand Creek Massacre. The discovery of gold along the front range of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado 1858 brought with it a tidal wave of non-Indian settlers. Soon, conflict erupted. In the fall of 1864, a Cheyenne leader named Black Kettle moved his band to Sand Creek, believing that they would avoid getting caught between the ongoing hostilities of different groups. Black Kettle even raised an American flag overhead, along with a white flag to signify peace and friendship. An armed force led by Colonel Shivington attacked Black Kettle's Cheyenne camp at Sand Creek. The motive for the attack was punishment for the raids on wagon trains. 163 Indians, including women and children, because remember, women and children matter more in the news, were mutilated and killed. War with the Sioux, Red Cloud's War, broke out in 1865. In 1862, gold was discovered in the Rocky Mountains. A new trail, the Boozman Trail, was created to allow miners access to the area. This trail passed through Sioux land and new mining towns were built. This again broke the Fort Laramie Treaty. The government encouraged miners to move to the area as the country was short of money after 4 years of civil war. In 1865, the Sioux began to attack travellers along the trail. The Sioux warrior Red Cloud led a force of many Sioux bands and even some allies from Cheyenne to Haparo. The government tried to open peace talks but continued to build forts along the trail. Red Cloud broke off negotiations and attacked the army. Although the Indians could not capture the US forts, they were able to lay siege to them, trap the soldiers inside, and attack parties that left the forts. The Indian forces also managed to prevent travellers from using the trail and even continued fighting throughout the winter. 80 US soldiers were trapped and killed in the FETTERMAN'S massacre. Phil Kearny was surrounded by Indian forces. The commander, Colonel Shivington, ordered his soldiers not to stray too far from the fort to avoid an ambush. In December 1866, a group of 80 men, led by Captain William Fetterman, rode out from the fort to protect a wood train. They were ordered not to ride past the Lodge Trail Ridge, but Fetterman saw an opportunity to inflict a defeat on the Indians. His men were lured into a trap and ambushed. All of the men were killed and their bodies mutilated. Some historians blame Fetterman for falling into the Indian trap. Public opinion started to shift. The Second Fort Laramie Treaty was signed in 1868 after Red Cloud's War. The US government agreed to close the Bozeman Trail. Red Cloud agreed to take his people to a reservation in Dakota, the Great Sioux Reservation, which was to be for the exclusive use of the Sioux Nation. Not all chiefs agreed with the arrangement. Individuals like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse refused to sign the treaty. A very simple date, but something that you need to know. In May 1869 was the completion of the transcontinental rail. Very important, now the East and the West are completely united and can be connected, and most importantly, both individuals, westward expansion, and US soldiers could be moved around with greater ease. The Indian Appropriations Act was passed in 1871 following Grant's peace policy and the appointment of Eli Parker as Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Parker argued that Indians should be seen as helpless and the government should decide what's best for them. He declared that the Plains Indians would no longer be recognised as an independent nation. This made it easier for the government to take land away from Indians and give it to settlers. The Timber and Culture Act of 1873 was an extension of the Homestead Act, offering 160 acres of land for free, provided that at least 40 acres was planted with trees. The idea that on the plains these trees would provide timber for fuel and also to act as a windbreak. June 1874, and gold is discovered in the Black Hills. Yeah, gold. White people. Natives. Do we really need to talk about this one? It was kind of a death sentence to the Native Americans, really. As soon as the gold was discovered, guess what happened? Yep. The white man went in. Spiritual place, you say? Beginning of life? Nah. Gold. The discovery of gold led to all-out war with the Sioux. The government did not stop the movement of miners going towards the Black Hills, but did offer to buy them. The Sioux, however, rejected this, and probably rightly so, considering their spiritual importance. In 1875, the Sioux were ordered to return to the reservation, but 7,000 Indian warriors led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse refused to go. The US Army planned to attack all Indians who were not on the reservations, and Generals Crook, Gibbon and Terry marched to surround the Indian warriors. The US Army had underestimated the number of Indians, and the timing of the attack left the three columns separated. This was made worse when Custer, who had been part of Terry's column, raced to be the first to confront the Indians and refused to take heavy Gatling guns. Custer's men were surrounded and slaughtered at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. In response, thousands of reinforcements were sent to fight the Indians, and by 1877 they had been defeated and forced onto reservations. In 1887, the Dawes Act broke up reservations further into smaller individual plots of land. Indians were encouraged to become farmers. Each family was given 160 acres of reservation land, easy to remember. They couldn't sell these allotments for the first 25 years. All land left after the allotments had been created could be sold to whites. The results of the Dawes Act was that whole tribes could no longer own land, and in fact it was owned by individuals. This was an anathema to the Native American culture. It led to the closure of the Indian frontier by 1890, giving the US government complete control of the plains. The Battle of Wounded Knee finally ended the resistance of Native Americans. A new religious movement called the Ghost Dance movement spread through the reservations from 1889. Many Indians believed that the dead would come back to life, the buffalo would be restored and the white man would disappear. The US government was threatened by this, and the army was ordered to force all Indians back onto the reservation. In 1890, a band of Indians were moved to Wounded Knee, where they were shot. 146 Indians were killed in the Wounded Knee massacre. The removal of the final Indian bands from the plains opened up millions of acres of land for Americans to settle. Thanks for making it to the end. I'll put some practice questions up should you wish to give these a go. Leave any questions you have in the comments if you're unsure about any of the content or what you would like to see next. Remember, these videos are here for your benefit, so if you like the video then you know what to do, and if you didn't, well then tell me how I may make them better. What with the coronavirus, I've got a lot of free time at home. Can you answer the question? Why are Native Americans so obsessed with the buffalo? And why are white people so obsessed with gold? Thanks for watching Lessons in History, and I'll see you in the next video.